So now let me turn to the example of R&D spending in the pharma industry. Question for you. Has pharma spent more money on R&D today than ever before in the history of the industry? Pharma spends a huge amount of money on R&D. So here's some numbers. If you take a look at R&D back in 1980, pharma, based on its own assessment, this is from the industry trade group, FHRMA, pharma, $2 billion were spent on R&D. And as of 2015, which is the latest estimate from their yearbook, $58.8 billion was spent in R&D in that 1 year. So certainly this number is bigger than it's ever been. But that hasn't adjusted for bird pie. So the way that we would use bird pie is this. Bird pie, take a base year of 1980 at being 100, okay? So you look at the bird pie tables, and they have the base year at 1980, which is 100. And this is what the value of bird pie is over the course of the years. Let's just divide by 100, so we get bird pie equaling 1 in 1980. That's your consumption basket. If you take your nominal wealth, in this case, $2 billion, divide that by your consumption basket, 2 billion divided by 1 is just 2 billion. So that's the amount of money you spent in real terms in 1980. However, in 1990, bird pie was 182. That's almost double in 10 years. So you've got to take the amount of money you spent in 1990, which is about 8.4 billion, and divide that by bird pie. That's the real amount of spending you did. And it turns out that you didn't spend 8.8 billion, you only spent 4.6 billion in real terms. That's how much of the real biomedical expenses you could afford, given that the prices have gone up. And so when you do this analysis, it turns out that in nominal terms, yes, the R&D spending in the pharma industry is the greatest that it's ever been in the history of the industry. But actually, in real terms, it kind of leveled off starting in 2006. And there was a period where pharma spent more in 2007 than it did last year. So this is a real problem. Because if we believe that there are all these breakthroughs that are occurring, then R&D should be increasing. Even when you take into account scale, it ought to be increasing as a percentage of sales or in nominal terms. But from a real perspective, it's actually not keeping up with bird pie. And the question is, why? Why are biomedical expenses going up? So I don't have an answer to that, but there is an economist at Princeton University by the name of William Baumol that proposed a very controversial, but I think fairly compelling explanation. So I want to take a few minutes to take you through that. And so it turns out that the explanation is what he describes the cost disease in a book that he published a few years ago with a number of his co-authors and collaborators. And Baumol's point is that, there are certain things that have gotten a lot cheaper thanks to automation and technology, like storage. But there are other things where we haven't had any kind of technological breakthroughs. He gives the example of going to a concert and listening to a string quartet. In the 1700s, if you wanted to experience a string quartet, what would you need? You would need 4 musicians, some instruments, and an hour in a concert hall. That was a string quartet. In 2017, if you want to experience a string quartet, what do you need? You need 4 musicians, some instruments, and about an hour in a concert hall. Where's the technological innovation there? We have a lot of benefits of modern technology like CDs, DVDs, Spotify, Shazam. You can listen online to almost anything you want. But if you want to experience what it was experienced in the 1700s of a set of musicians playing for you, you need the same physical resources that you did 300 and some odd years ago. There haven't been any real technological improvements. And so you would expect that there's going to be a difference in costs. So let me just show you in equation form what Baumol was trying to say and make it more obscure, but subject to quantitative discussion. Inflation is an average across lots of different consumption goods. So I'm going to show you what that average looks like. What I showed you before was the definition of inflation is the cost of your consumption bundle next year divided by the cost of that same consumption bundle this year minus 1. That is the rate of inflation for you, right? So let's unpack that. That's going to be equal to the price next year times the quantities in your basket. And I'm going to keep the quantities fixed because otherwise we're comparing apples to oranges, right? I'm going to focus on the same consumption bundle next year as this year. The question is, what's the difference in the cost? So the Qs, the quantities, are the same next year versus this year. But the prices next year are given by P1, T plus 1, P2, T plus 1, and so on. And the denominator is the prices this year multiplied by those same quantities, right? Minus 1. I can rewrite that as the ratio of the prices minus 1 times these weights, where P1, Q1 over CT is the amount of consumption in particular asset 1 that you are consuming this year, the amount of consumption good 2 you're consuming this year, and so on. So the inflation rate across your entire basket is simply a weighted average of the inflations of each one of your commodities, right? Any questions about this? It's not a very deep analysis. It just says that the inflation rate that we know and love in the United States, it's probably somewhere around 2%. Inflation of 2% is a weighted average of housing inflation, transportation inflation, education inflation, medical inflation, and so on. So getting back to the cost disease, I want to say that inflation is the average of all of these different items, right? We all agree with that? Okay? So you know where I'm going with this now, I think, right? If inflation is 2%, and I just told you that me, a computer geek, is wildly better off because my consumption bundle for memory chips has an inflation of, I don't know, minus, 150%. It's gone down tremendously in price. Then what does that tell you about some of the other items? If there are some components that have negative inflation, deflation, if things have gotten a lot cheaper in certain sectors, then by definition, other components have to be higher, right? Much higher than average. Not all of us can be above average. Well, actually, at MIT we can, but that's a separate story. Here at MIT, based on MIT standards, you can't all be above average for MIT, even if you are above average for the rest of the world. And so clearly, if something is well below average, something's got to be above average. So that's Baumol's first point. The second point that he makes is there's not a randomness to that. There's a reason that certain things are below average. It's because there have been advances in productivity. So in particular, producing memory chips has been a lot cheaper today than ever before because of advances in technology. Whereas string quartets have not experienced a lot of technological advances. And so you're not going to expect the same decline in pricing